sophistication. But we've got a very interesting caller coming in, a former Conservative Member of Parliament for Tatton, a seat that has very interesting Conservatives. It was held then by George Osborne and now by the absolutely brilliant Esther McVey, one of the finest members of the House of Commons. But this is Neil Hamilton, who is a leading figure in UKIP, a member of the Welsh Parliament currently. Neil, hello, how are you?
Good morning, Jacob. I'm very well, thank you.
Good morning. Are you calling from Wiltshire?
I am, yes, at the moment, yeah.
That's excellent, because Somerset and Wiltshire have a very long-standing association since King Alfred defeated the Danes in 879, so Wiltshire callers are very welcome.
Indeed, when we had the first king of all
But over
England,
to you, what do you want?
And buried locally.
Excellent. So you've obviously been intimately involved with this. You know exactly what's going on in UKIP. Do you think this spells the end of UKIP as a political party?
No, I think it's a new beginning, actually. Unfortunately, Henry Bolton, I'm afraid, got into a situation where his private life actually prevented us from talking about the things that really matter, like what sort of Brexit we're going to get and what's the future of Britain after Brexit. And he seems to live in a sort of alternative universe. He thinks that although you're the leader of a political party, you can behave in your private life in a way which can be kept away from public view. Well, you and I know that's absolutely impossible. And he showed no understanding of this at any time in the last month, as a result of which the ongoing carry-on farce of his private life was laundered very, very publicly to everybody's embarrassment. And it therefore got in the way of UKIP articulating what its purpose is now, which is something which clearly we must do.
But, Neil, do you think that Mr. Bolton is a symptom or a cause? If he were the only leader who'd got into difficulties, what you're saying would be very powerful. But he's the seventh leader in 18 months, and when you look through what tripped up the other leaders, they were being tripped up for all sorts of extraordinary, simplistic mistakes that you wouldn't expect a professional political party to have in its leadership. So it's not just Mr. Bolton, it's all the others. It's Paul Nuttall who found things difficult. I mean, the names, most of them one forgets, but seven in 18 months.
Well, I think that over-eggs the pudding, really. The problem has been that Nigel...
There's quite a lot of eggs, though, in the pudding, isn't it?
Well, no, but fundamentally, we've only had one leader since Nigel Farage gave up, and that was Paul Nuttall. We've had a series of interim leaders who, for a variety of reasons, had to be put in place. But we've only had one real leader since then, and Paul Nuttall, unfortunately, he wasn't up to the job.
But you lost one candidate in a punch-up in the European Parliament.
No, but actually...
we weren't quite this... We never lost... That was a candidate. But you lost a leadership candidate because of punch-up in the European Union. You lost Paul Nuttall because there were questions about the election and all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, there was no punch-up, actually. That was a complete set-up. Mike Hookham, who was an MEP who was accused of throwing the punch, denies that anything ever happened. So I mean, I think we must.
But I'm not
concentrate on the realities of this. You know, Nigel Farage was a super dominant leader, a highly dynamic force.
Yeah.
Nobody has had a greater effect than Nigel from outside Parliament since the war, and he was so dominant that he never brought anybody on to succeed him, and we have struggled in the interim. That's certainly true, and also we're the victims of our own success, of course, with the result of the Brexit referendum, and UKIP now has to reorient itself into a domestic...
But Neil, isn't that the key point, that you're a victim of your own success and that the leadership fandango doesn't really matter? What matters is that UKIP achieved the vote to leave, and it doesn't now have a very clear purpose. And once we've left, it's very hard to see what its role will be at all.
Well, not at all, because I lead the UKIP Assembly members in Cardiff, and we operate there in a domestic parliamentary context, in the same way as you operate in a domestic parliamentary context in Westminster, as well as the European issue. And you know, we are daily saying what we believe on the health service, on education, on the environment, etc., etc. And UKIP fought the last general election, of course, on a full UK domestic programme, and we fought the Welsh elections in
But
May
nobody was
2016
interested, dare I say, in your manifesto at the last election, because people were interested in UKIP to get us out of the European Union, and what you had to say on everything else was entirely secondary, and that's why UKIP's vote went down so badly, isn't it, at the last election, because you'd achieved your purpose?
Well, I think that's right. A lot of people thought that we'd achieved our purpose, but we do have a wider purpose. And we have a vision of what Britain should be like once Brexit has been achieved. We're the only party that's... let me give you a few examples. Can I perhaps to explain what I mean? We're the only party that really believes in tough immigration control. We're the only party that thinks we should scrap most of the aid budget and put it into the health service. We're the only party in Wales that supports grammar schools, for example. We're the only party that wants to scrap green taxes, which are subsidising forests of windmills that are desecrating the countryside. There are all sorts of policies that UKIP is unique on, which the Conservative Party certainly isn't following us.
But isn't there a feeling that you've invented policies to give yourself something to do because you've achieved your main objective, and that all these policies are deeply secondary?
Well, they're obviously secondary to the overriding objective of recovering our national independence and sovereignty. There can be no more important issue in British politics, I'm sure you would agree, than that. But we will achieve that sooner or later, and then we will concentrate entirely upon domestic political issues and foreign affairs, of course, but principally on domestic political issues. And we do have a particular outlook on the world which none of the other parties completely shares, or indeed shares at all in most cases.
OK, so you think clearly that there is a continuing role for UKIP and wouldn't accept my suggestion that Tory-minded UKIP members should simply rejoin the Conservative Party. Who do you think can lead it, other than Nigel Farage?
Well, Gerard Batten, I think, would make a perfectly good leader for the longer term. I don't know who may come forward. I'm not going to come forward myself because I've got a full-time job leading the party in Wales. But I think that's a secondary matter for the time being, actually. What we need to do, first of all, is to fill the gap that you pinpointed a moment ago in people's minds about what UKIP's purpose now is. And as I say,
But you're the one...
have a fully costed manifesto on which we stood in the general election, which was very, very different from the Conservative manifesto in lots of important respects. And there are lots of people in UKIP who were previously in other parties, in the Labour Party, and indeed who have never been involved in politics before. So we are a grassroots movement, very different from established political parties that have been around for a very, very long time. And the Trump phenomenon in America was exactly the same as the phenomenon which created UKIP. We articulate a view which the mainstream established parties cannot do.
And you feel possibly that you may be the right man to do it for an interim period before other people are ready to try and steady the ship and bring some calm to a party you see a bright future for? Could you be persuaded? Will you announce your candidature live on LBC?
Well, the only reason I would do that is for you, Jacob, but I'm not going to.
I'd be very grateful.
But because, I do have a full-time job, in effect, because when the Welsh Assembly is sitting, it's 4 days a week in Cardiff, and I do have a constituency which is 75% of the landmass of Wales, and as a party leader I've got other obligations as well. But I will play my full part as part of a team leadership in UKIP, which is, I think, what we need now. We need the opposite of what Nigel provided, I think, in the short term. We don't want one super dynamic individual to lead the party, because we've got to bring everything together, and we've got a lot of hard work to do to persuade the public that we have a purpose in life post-Brexit. I believe we can do that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for calling in. It's a pleasure to hear from you, and I'm sorry I couldn't twist your arm to throw your hat into the ring. You're listening to Jacob Rees-Mogg on LBC, leading Britain's conversation from Somerset. I'm standing in for Nigel Farage. It is almost exactly